Hi, Rena.
Hello, hello, Dr. Bach.
Thank you. Hello to you too. When I present organic intelligence, I have that $1 Amazon essay. I have this YouTube channel. I have the Substack. I'm presenting an extremely simplified and essentialized. I'm presenting organic intelligence in an extremely simplified and essentialized way for many reasons, which I may get into in the future at some point. And I try to boil it down to the two essentials, the two fundamentals of orientation and pleasure. And of these two, orientation and pleasure, I try to focus way more on orientation than pleasure. The $1 thing I have on the the Amazon essay, it's only about orientation. And it wasn't, I actually made a decision not to talk about pleasure, not due to laziness, but because I thought I really wanted to emphasize how much orientation is the fundamental over pleasure, even though both are important. So that's why I deliberately presented only on orientation. I think I had a few sentences on pleasure, but I really wanted to scream at people. It's orientation, 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 orientation.
In other words, orientation is everything, says
Orientation,
Steve.
orientation is everything. And there's the second thing called pleasure. Pleasure is commonsensically regarded as a good thing. I mean, by almost everyone, pleasure is good, pain is bad. There's a lot more to say there in terms of philosophy, but pleasure is distinctively important in organic intelligence as running second place to orientation, and that's our focus today, or our beginning, starting point. Are you willing to take the baton and have me ask you, why is pleasure important and interesting to talk about, especially if most people regard it as a common sense good thing? So we don't, why even talk about it when it's so commonsensically good? Yeah.
Yeah, commonsensically good on one level, but a lot of opposition underlying for many people.
Yeah.
I think it is worth saying, though, the reason we boil things down to pleasure and pain is because pleasure is that which increases the likelihood of surviving and increasing well-being. And pain is that which decreases the possibility of surviving and also diminishes our well-being. And so, as a compass, that can be very useful in just understanding that which serves us and that which doesn't serve us.
What you just said there, uh, pleasure is in line with what serves our well-being. Pain is in line with what injures us. Yes, I feel in some sense, it could be regarded as obvious or common sense. In some other sense, once you think through stuff and see objections and sources of resistance, it acquires a greater level of depth and importance as you sort through what the elaboration and the resistance. And what comes to mind right now is actually Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged said there are two fundamental sensations, pleasure and pain, and two fundamental emotions, joy and suffering. And the first pair, pleasure and joy, are indicators of pro well being activity, and pain and suffering are indications of that which is injurious to you, not good for you. And in this very moment, I'm feeling both that these are kind of obvious, common sense. Why bother talking about this? And this is worth really talking about because it's so fundamental.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. There's can be underlying, well, there's several things, right? One, there's can be underlying uh, feelings, senses, thoughts about the pursuit and seeking after of pleasure. So there's one thing to say, oh, if I happen to do something and I happen to feel pleasure, well, then that just is. That's just a biological function of the experience. It's another thing to talk about the pursuit of pleasure, the seeking of pleasure as a active, reasoned activity. And that's where I think people get hung up with that, because it can often be conflated with ideas that the pursuit of pleasure is selfish or that the pursuit of pleasure is harmful.
Uh, oh, I have an impulse to give an example.
Go for it.
If unless you were going to roll on with something, but really just free association, right? This is I'm feeling the reality of this topic very much in the moment, the importance of pleasure and the idea that many people have that pursuing pleasure may be harmful. So here's my example. With my YouTube channel and with all my public facing online activity, the YouTube channel and the Substack, I have I guide myself based on pleasure. So when I feel like doing a YouTube video, I do it. When I don't feel like doing it, when I don't feel like doing one, I don't. And when I feel like doing a YouTube video, whatever content I want to talk about, whatever content I feel pleasure in talking about, I talk about that and post it. That's really, really the guide, in the moment pleasure. And there has been a source of torture about whether I'm doing the right thing for my long term well being, including my career well being. Many people have given me advice, many people who I regard as wise, trustworthy, who are mentors to me, and who are in the worlds of both organic, many people in the organic intelligence world and in the objectivist Ayn Rand world have given me the advice: don't talk about Ayn Rand, don't be controversial. If your goal is to promote your career, then you have to dig into sage business advice about how to market yourself and how to get more views and how to get likes. And you don't want to be offensive to people. And you really want to think about your long-term self-interest, which may require not doing what you want to do in the moment. So I've received a lot of that advice, and I took it very seriously because I want to be rational, and because the people who are giving me the advice I trust. It's not just randos. And I have basically ignored all this advice. And so when I want to post something, if it's going to be controversial and offensive, it's going to be controversial and offensive because I want to do it. It gives me pleasure. And this, I feel like I'm belaboring too long, but one more thing is I know by now what kinds of videos will get more attention and likes. And I often just don't want to do those videos. I want to do other videos, which I know will be many people will not like, but I still do it because I get pleasure from it. And many people in my life will say they're not sure if I'm doing the right thing for my long-term self-interest. And my position right now is I want my long-term self-interest, my long-term happiness to be constituted by being able to be free in the moment to do what I want to do and what gives me pleasure, even if there may be opportunity costs from every individual choice of pleasure over pain.
Well, right, because that would be only looking at one element of that potential opportunity cost. So if your career is the most important thing to you and is going to bring the highest level of pleasure, then one would maybe like to see if what you're doing in the moment is in alignment with that long-term goal. But it may be that for some person, and maybe this is for you, right, that long-term career goal isn't the most pleasurable thing for you. Being able to have freedom might be more pleasurable. Being able to have enough time to go surfing in Southern California might be. I don't know that's your thing, but
I like that example.
being able to play piano, like all of these things might be way more pleasurable. And so doing YouTube videos that are in line with what brings you pleasure in the moment allows more freedom to have pleasure in other things, right? So whether or not your long-term career is your ultimate, level of pleasure, that could be debated. So there's lots of people who have chosen careers that, say make less money than they could. So a person who chooses, say, teaching over finance, right? So you could probably make a lot more money in finance, and yet you want to be a teacher. So that's
Mm.
going to be more pleasurable. So it depends on what we're measuring. So I said in the beginning, it's both survival and well-being. Well, most of us don't have that much survival pressure, at least in the US. I mean, some people do, of course, but in terms of having a roof over a house and food to eat and a smartphone if that's necessary, like we a car to get to work and have a job, there's a lot of the survival things that are taken care of to some degree or another. It's the well-being piece that becomes much more complicated, I think. So
Yeah.
survival is food, shelter, warmth, a certain level of activity. Like there, we know what contributes to good survival, but what contributes to well-being long term, that's much more individualistic.
I hear you, and everything that you just said, I agree with completely. And I felt like this is boring stuff I've heard 1,000 times. And this is not, I wasn't intending to criticize your content. When, as you were talking, I felt like I had a hat on of many people viewing this. I think pretty much everyone has been exposed to the idea you have to prioritize your well being, not other things over your happiness. Like instead of prioritizing money or status or fame or power, you should really prioritize your happiness and your pleasure and your well-being. That's a thing. That's an idea people are exposed to a lot, and I think a lot of people are bored by it. I mean, they would much rather watch a video about how to make $1 million as fast as possible in the stock market or the crypto market rather than how to increase your well-being. I mean, those get a lot of views too, but there's something I think for many people, and to myself in certain moods, there's something nebulous and suspicious or vague or not real. Do you vibe with me on that? Like, do you have that
Yeah,
sense?
right. And yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because again, as I said, it's super individualistic and idiosyncratic and many people, there are people, of course, lots of people who pursue, say, making money in the stock market and want to do that. And then there's lots of people who feel immense shame or guilt for doing that and feel like they are not allowed to pursue that pleasure. So there are all kinds of quote unquote spiritual teachings that will guide you in the direction of don't pursue your own pleasure. Don't pursue what you desire. Don't follow those things because they are going to lead you in a dangerous direction. And so I think yes, there are some people who are going to listen to this and go, well, yeah, of course. And then there's going to be all kinds of people who listen and go, no, that's not a legitimate pursuit.
I do think many people have a very complicated relationship to pleasure and happiness, including strong desire for, strong aversion to, suspicion of, indifference to. I think it's uninteresting or too obvious. So I'm appreciating there's a lot of different attitudes people can have towards pleasure and happiness. And that the idea that you just presented, many spiritual teachers who are criticizing people who pursue pleasure, they will often they will typically argue your pursuit of pleasure is what's causing you suffering. So what you need to do is not pursue the pleasure you're pursuing and somehow have tea with your suffering, and that's the way to pleasure. And when I hear that argument, which is all over the place in Eastern traditions, spiritual traditions, I'm very suspicious. It's like there's a contradiction happening, or they want to they're they say they're pro pleasure and pro well being, that's their impetus, and the way they're defending or promulgating their pro pleasure and well being message is to criticize people who are pursuing pleasure. I find that to be suspicious.
Well, yeah, because there's an inherent contradiction.
and I know that they would combat and say, well, we're not being contradictory. We're saying that you're grasping for money, sex, food, drugs, alcohol, parties, roller coasters. That's going to cause you suffering. So real happiness comes from sitting here and looking at a plant and tracking your breath.
Well, and in organic intelligence, we often do orientation, but orientation is not a doing. So we may like notice the wind that's blowing the palm fronds, or we may notice the sound of the ocean or a certain bird. Like we may have awareness of, and organic intelligence promotes the increasing awareness of that, and increasingly in a non-doing kind of way, right? That orientation is just a state of being and taking in what's from the external environment. But that does not in and of itself deny pleasure, nor is that the end of
Mm.
the road. So there's a reason we have orientation. There's a reason orientation is primary, because that's trying to get people back into this present state of being where one is just taking in and possibly even noticing what's in the environment so that they can better pursue pleasure and avoid that which creates pain. So the more quote unquote oriented a person is, the more a person is taking in their immediate environment, the more likely they will be to notice that, oh, here comes a snake down the road and I should probably go a different direction. Or be able to notice that, oh, here's an opportunity that's available to me to get some more of what I might need or want for my well-being. So orientation has, to me, has a foundation. But if we just stopped with that, we're just like the animals. Like animals are oriented. They're spending their time noticing their environment and adjusting their actions accordingly. But we have the possibility to reason. We have a possibility of not just having moments of pleasure and pain be willy-nilly. They just happen to come across our path. We happen to eat. We happen to, well, I should be a little careful because even animals can pursue those things, right? So animals can pursue food and then enjoy the eating of it, right? There's going to be some pleasure to that. But there's a capacity that we have to make choices about that which is our well-being. So if you're a coyote, you don't have many choices about which food you're going to eat. You're going to eat the rabbits because that's what's there. But we actually have a choice of the food that we eat and the means by which we try to get that food, and all of that choice expands our capacity to have pleasure. And so orientation is not sufficient. Pleasure is actually has to go hand in hand as what we as reasoning individuals engage in.
Yeah, orientation, which is effortless connection to the environment through the senses, gives the foundation in your biology of intensity that's not too high, so that your attention is freer than otherwise, right? And from that foundation, you can then pay attention to pleasure and what brings pleasure. So I think I'm circling around something that is kind of that obvious and also important and profound, depending on the angle. There was an objectivist philosopher who gave the advice. Someone asked, "Can you? Your talk was very abstract and philosophical. Do you have any practical advice, like real life advice?" And she said, "Pay attention to what you like." And her example was, you're having dinner, you're eating swordfish, you find it's good. I like swordfish. Pay attention. You've learned something. I like swordfish. And I remember that example because it was such a contrast to the abstract level of the lecture. And when we're oriented, we're more likely to pay attention to what gives us pleasure. If we're not oriented and if we're just driven by high intensity and autopilot high intensity, pick up the kids, make money, check stocks, da, 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 da. It's just you're just driven by intensity, intensity, intensity. That's too much noise, and that prevents opportunities where you're more likely able to and may notice what actually feels good. This breeze, I like swordfish. I don't like capers. I do like black coffee. I don't like it with sugar. That's so foundational, right? Noticing what gives you pleasure and feeling it.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's why it's one of the fundamentals that I teach when I'm working with people around shame and chronic shame, especially because very often that sense of I like something has been somehow extinguished, right? Whether it be through, experiences or abuse or lack of paying attention and support, there's all kinds of ways that we can have that obscured from our awareness. And because of the nature of it, there's going to be a lot of intensity on board. And so this sense of beginning to explore, what do I like, and being able to pay attention to that and think about that and then share it with others, so you get a feedback loop happening that, oh, I like that, and that's a great thing that you like that. That becomes fundamental to the process of sensing, like, oh, I'm allowed to, or I can, because when there's been a lot of high intensity in the developmental years, that can be obliterated and be very difficult for people to feel like they can connect to, which is why sometimes these ideas of don't pursue pleasure or don't have desire they latch onto it because, well, that's what they experience already. And so it just supports that very intense state that they're experiencing.
It, it sounds like it could be scary to learn what you like and don't like. There could be many contexts in which it's anxiety provoking or terrifying to learn I like I like this person, not that person. I don't like this about my partner. I like this food. I want to go here. I want to do this with this person. I'm being a little bit abstract because I had details, but I didn't want to get too graphic. But um, it could be scary to gain awareness of what you like and don't like, I think. And the question is, why could that be why might that be scary? One reason is then you have to deal with it somehow. Like you've learned something about what you like and don't like. What are you going to do? Are you just, well, I'm just going to ignore that and continue with the pattern I have that I'm stable with, and I'll just keep living and ignore what I like and don't like and try not to learn more about what I like and don't like so I can just keep doing that until I die, which would be really scary, especially if there's only one life. And if you're going to confront what you like and don't like, what are you going to do? Are you going to think about how to pursue it? And will that trigger, it's impossible, or I might fail, or what does this mean about me that I like this? Uh, Examples would be good here, but I'm flowing with being abstract. So
Well, I
I'm
think
seeing how pleasure can be scary.
right. Well, the example you gave in the beginning, I think, is of yourself. I think is really good in that way. That pursuing the pleasure of choosing which videos you record and topics that you enjoy may have the potential of not allowing you to earn as much money, say, in the future. So there is risk to that. There's inherent in making a choice of one thing over another that we might be wrong. That might actually happen. That, oh, you might look back and 20 years later going, yeah, I kind of regret that decision. I didn't make the best decision for myself. Or you may look back 20 years later and go, that was the best decision I could have ever made. I'm so glad I did that. So anytime we make a choice, we're eliminating the infinite possibility of a whole bunch of other choices,
Yeah.
right? And so there is you could say, I guess, in some way, there's a certain level of risk to that. At the same time, there's a much greater risk if you don't do that. If you aren't aware of your likes and what brings pleasure, then you won't be able to pursue that which is uniquely gifted to you. So the reason why somebody, pursues playing the cello as a professional musician, and then there's me who just dinks around with it, is that to that person, it's super enjoyable to do that. And at some point, it was less enjoyable for me. And that's probably because I actually wasn't as gifted. Like I didn't have the same level of skills or ability to acquire that skill. So those likes give us information about even what we're really good at, and so that can give us information about what to pursue or not pursue in life.
The idea that came to me as you were speaking, I'm not saying you said this, but it came to me like it was implied or something. It was paying it, pursuing pleasure and paying attention to pleasure could be actually the low risk way to live, the conservative way to live. I'm not sure if I buy this. I'm just an idea in the moment, okay? But because you begin with like, if I pay attention to if I start paying attention to what I like and pursue pleasure and not worry about other things so much. That may be risky, but it could be much riskier to not pay attention to pleasure. And that makes sense to me. In this connection, one thing Ayn Rand said once was, "I'm not brave enough to be a coward." That deserves more, but I'll just so. Could it be the conservative thing, the the safest? Okay, here we go. Not saying this is true or whatever, but this is the safest way to live, to pursue pleasure, because then you're paying attention in the moment, constantly, continuously, to what brings you joy, instead of committing to, I'll do 4 years of medical school and then this and then this, and then I'll be happy 20 years from now. It's like, what's going to happen to your psychology in the meantime is, if you keep delaying gratification and ignoring, well, I'm just going to, this is for my future 5-7 years of suffering, and then I'll be gloriously happy afterward. But that's one idea in organic intelligence and from objectivism, is that your soul, your biology, is very delicate and tender. And to just think, well, I'm just going to suffer for 2 years, then I'll be happy forever, is very dubious. Like, what's going to happen to your biology and your psychology if you start feeding suffering instead of pleasure? You know.
And what I'm thinking about is, this brings up the question is, well, what about, there may be pursuits that are pleasurable in and of themselves and in terms of also the end goal, but involves some kind of difficulty. So to become a medical doctor, if you decide that you want to do that and you start doing all the courses, the biology and organic and chemistry and that kind of stuff through high school and college, and then you go to the next thing, there's some really difficult times. And, I haven't been there, so I don't know by experience, but I have watched all kinds of friends go through this. And there's a lot of difficulty. There's sleepless nights. There's studying all hour. So how do we distinguish the difference between that which is difficult but is still pleasurable, and that which might be difficult and is creating suffering?
I'm not going to have a helpful answer. I'm actually going to exacerbate the problem you're raising, and I know we're running out, but of the minutes here. But so I'm going to land something. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but uh, one thing I'm exposed to often is, from people around me and friends and so forth, is there's often these, like, comparing white people with Asian people in a half joking, half serious manner. And one thing stories I've been told are, friends of mine who are very pro Asian culture, they say, look at this white family. They raise their kids to party, have fun, don't worry about the future too much, don't save, don't focus on academics, and they have fun when they're young. But when they're older, they're poor, they're in debt, they're stressed, they're suffering, they have to work menial jobs. And look at this Asian family. They raise their kids very strict, very, very strict, rice and fish, piano, tutoring, lots of school, and you're going to be a doctor or engineer and a lawyer. And there's a lot of suffering for the kids, but then they end up rich and very stable and networked, and optically their lives look a lot better than the white people who, when they were younger, spent a lot of time partying, and then became poor and just really perturbed later on. I don't have a lesson there or a solution, but that's what came to me as a possible, a dramatic scenario that someone would present who's arguing against pursuing pleasure now.
Right. Which I would say that's actually a straw man.
A straw man. Okay.
To characterize the pursuit of pleasure that way. Because if you were to truly pursue pleasure, it's going to be with thoughtfulness. And so the family who doesn't teach their kids, families don't generally teach their kids to party other than usually by example. But if that's the pursuit, one would even question, is that truly pleasurable in the moment? And so here we're getting into that whole definition. What is pleasurable? And so partying a lot is not necessarily going to be towards your long-term or even short-term well-being. And so that's why I would essentially say that's a straw man. And to your point that there may be that, this idea that you have to suffer first in order to have long-term well-being, you already brought up, well, that might be dangerous, because you might get yourself into positions where, well, maybe you're okay with that career that you kind of were choosing or forced upon you. I don't know which one it is. Maybe you're not. I think the thing that we would encourage, or I would encourage, I think you do too, is that we want there to be thoughtfulness. So you were saying earlier that the pursuit of pleasure requires you to actually pay attention to the feedback that comes from your action. So if you pursue something and the feedback that comes back is, oh, I hated that, or I wasn't enjoying that, or that felt really good, and wow, I want to do more of that. Like you create a video and go, wow, that felt good. I think I'll create another video. But if you go, geez, I hated that, but that's what people told me I need to do, that would be problematic because then you're not paying attention and you're really being irrational in that point at that
Ouch,
moment.
ouch, ouch.
That well, I'm not saying you because you actually enjoy doing these videos. But so to me, that's the important is I personally wouldn't want my parents or as a parent to be telling people what they should do. I want to teach them to be thoughtful and to pay attention to the feedback they're receiving
Mm.
about, do you like fishing? What about fishing did you actually like? Was it the catching the fish? Was it the looking at the beautifulness of the fish? Was it the fact that we were just sitting there having conversation and it was a great, conversation, parent to child? Or was it the fact that we didn't talk at all and you just laid there and in the sun? Like, what about fishing did you really like? That's going to be information for you about actually what is pleasurable, not just the fishing, but what about the fishing is pleasurable. All of that as a parent is what I would want to encourage children, and then as they grow older and older, to really be considering.
There's your mic drop, Rena. And nice. And I think we've opened a can of worms that deserve to be examined further. And we're on our time. And this is pleasurable and underscores the importance of orientation because you want to be settled enough in your biology so that you can think about this stuff instead of being hijacked by high intensity. Yeah.
For sure. And we can talk more about what that looks
Okay.
like when hijacked with high intensity and how that relates to pleasure, laughter.
All right. Thank you. And I'll see you next week and wishing a pleasurable day and life to our viewers. Yeah.
Indeed, indeed.